This is an Easter sermon based upon the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 1 through 18. As I drove to work one Monday morning, I was listening to NPR radio, and they were talking about gorillas. Believe it or not, gorillas are the basis of this Easter Sunday sermon. The topic under discussion was the way that we see or fail to see things that are right under our noses. The NPR host was interviewing a Harvard researcher who studies the connection between eyesight and our brain's expectation of what we might see. This is quite a relevant topic, I believe, to Mary's sight of an empty tomb and two angels in white sitting where she knew the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and one at the feet. Well, the researcher first described the foundational study that fascinated him. In that study, researchers showed a group of volunteers a brief movie of two sports teams throwing a ball back and forth to one another. Viewers were given the very simple task to count the number of times that the team in the white shirts threw the ball to one another. Simple enough, right? Well, in the midst of the movie, the researchers had a man dressed as a gorilla walk through the game. And at the end of the movie, they asked viewers how many people had noticed the gorilla on the screen. They found that only 50%, or half of those watching the movie, had seen the gorilla. The other 50% had been so intent upon counting the number of throws of that ball among the white-shirted team that they missed the gorilla altogether. Well, the researcher then went on to test the assumption that radiologists would be more likely to see the gorilla because they, of course, are medical specialists who are trained to look at x-rays in order to diagnose illness. In theory, radiologists see even small aberrations on the screen. They have trained eyes. So the researcher spent many days watching radiologists at work. The researcher said he was amazed that he couldn't even see what the radiologist saw when they pointed it out to him. They saw tiny but very life-saving aberrations on x-rays that could lead to eventual diagnosis and treatment of the ill. Surely, the researcher thought, the radiologists will do better than the general public when given the gorilla test because they're trained to look more closely at x-rays than most of us ever look at anything. So he gave the gorilla test to the radiologists, overlaying a matchbook-sized picture of a gorilla onto the x-ray for 30 seconds. And then he asked the radiologists, how many gorillas did they see while examining their x-rays? Show of hands. How many of you think the doctors did better than the general public at detecting the gorilla? How many of you think the doctors saw the gorilla fewer times than the general public? And how many of you, finally, think that the doctors and the general public were about the same in finding that gorilla? Well, the research showed that radiologists missed the gorilla an astounding 83% of the time. That Harvard researcher was not trying to decrease our faith in radiologists. He was trying to show that research proves that more often than we think, we tend to see what we are looking for, especially when we have been trained to look for something specific. He suggested that the way we train doctors to look for illness, security forces to look for terrorists, parents to look after their children, may need some tweaking. The reason I've spent so much of your time this Easter Sunday morning relating the results of this study about gorillas to you is that I believe there are deep spiritual implications of this study for us upon our spiritual journeys. This study raises the question, what are you looking for in life? Are you looking for fame and money, security and pleasure? Or are you looking for meaning in an empty tomb and the path that follows Jesus' footsteps up to and beyond that cross? Have you been told that your religious task is to appease a vengeful God by never messing up? Or have you been told, as our theology in the United Church of Christ proclaims, that our religious task is to do the best we can do to enjoy and to care for the creation that God has given us to love? Are you constantly on the lookout for intentional slights, uneven advantages given to the other guy, and glasses that are half empty instead of half full? We all know people like that, don't we? Or do you tend to look for the best intentions in other people, make the best of the hand you've been dealt, and characterize that glass as half full? In short, do you ever stop doing what you are doing long enough to see the beauty and the gorilla in your midst? With no disrespect intended, I think the resurrection can be compared to that gorilla in our midst. The resurrection of Jesus, and therefore of ourselves, is a fact that imbues every moment of our lives. But we are so busy counting white shirts or money and looking for illness or problems that we fail to see that great and glorious good news that is right here among us in our own faces. Let's admit it. The resurrection is the foundational fact of Christian theology. But how many times do we Christians ever think about the meaning of the resurrection? How many times do we think about resurrection at all in a week or a day or a month? Most of us, honestly, only think about it once a year. Today's Easter reading from the Gospel of John ends with Mary Magdalene's announcement to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." Please notice that Mary could only make this declaration after she had mistaken Jesus for a gardener. The Bible tells us clearly that while weeping, Mary turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Today I suggest that we too have seen Jesus but mistaken him for a lackey, a servant, a nobody, or even someone so familiar as a gardener in a garden, that we have failed to see the goodness in front of our eyes. Every time that we see a sunrise or a sunset and we take it for granted, we have missed the gorilla of God's resurrection in our midst. Every time we hear beautiful music or we hear the laughter of children, God is there, resurrected and resurrecting. Every time we share a meal with friends, learn a new dance step, pet a companion animal, or smile at a stranger who smiles back, we are resurrected in faith and hope and love. What is the name of your gorilla? Where do you experience your own resurrections? I think on this Easter Sunday morning, it is more important to contemplate these questions than to talk about the reality or scientific improbability of a bodily resurrection. It took Mary Magdalene a bit of time to overcome a case of mistaken identity and to see Jesus clearly in an empty tomb. So be patient with yourself when you're looking for Jesus too. Focus not so much on what you've been trained to see, on what someone has taught you to be the meaning of resurrection, but upon truly what is right in front of you. Add to your blessing jar, as I taught the children during the children's message. Every single day, find those blessings. count them, and you too will be finding the gorilla in your midst. Happy, happy Easter to one and all.